So first of all, just the usual disclosures. We have this publishing company, and it's about neuropsychiatry, so disclose that. We don't make any money, but we do like to get this way of examining patients into people's pockets, and I get a small stipend in addition to my university salary from being one of the directors of the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology. So, Marcel Proust, in Remembrance of Things Past, his narrator tells the story of dipping this cookie, which is called what?
Madeleine.
A petite madeleine. He dips it in hot tea, takes a bite, and suddenly he's transported back to his childhood, visiting with his Aunt Leonie in a village called Combray. And although he couldn't remember his childhood experiences in Combray until he did that, suddenly he's flooded with vivid panoramic memory of Combray. And in honor of his description, this effect of involuntary sensory evoked autobiographical recall is sometimes called the Petite Madeleine effect. You want me to stay on screen?
Oh, yeah, if you could,
People can see.
yeah, the people online, if you can check that you're, I don't know if you
Oh,
can,
it's coming from my camera.
yeah, if you can just start your computer. And
Yeah.
just get-
All right. You don't need to see me. You really don't need to see me, but
Yeah.
so this is Father Matteo Ricci. He may not be familiar to you. He was a 16th century Jesuit priest and mathematician who was sent on mission to China in the early 1600s to, of course, win converts in China to Christianity. But his method was to introduce the Chinese, who he knew valued the acquisition of knowledge and science highly. He was there to teach them about memory palaces. And Matteo Ricci also, by the way, was the first Westerner to gain a reading and writing knowledge of Chinese and published the first Portuguese-Chinese dictionary. So what are memory palaces? I'm sure you're familiar with that term, but you may not know where it came from. But the idea of a memory palace is that you build yourself a place in your mind. It's also called the method of loci. And you put things that you wish to remember in different distinct places in that palace. Now, you're welcome to create as many rooms in your palace as you like. You can decorate each one distinctly as you will, so you'll remember it. And then in theory, you would then remember what you placed there. Now, this method is originally attributed to a Greek philosopher poet named Simonides. And we're back in 5 centuries BCE. And the story, legend, whatever, is told that Simonides was a guest at the banquet of a nobleman. And all of in that village, the people in that caste were there, seated around a large banquet table. Simonides wanted to go out to get some air, so he left the building, and while he was out taking a walk, a storm blew up, the house collapsed, everyone was killed, except for Simonides. The leaders of the town wanted to know whom to notify. There were a lot of people at this banquet, and they asked if he had any recollection. He says, well, and in his mind, he went around the table and named every one of a large number of people by name, and said, well, of course, that's the way I remember things. And so it's to him, whether it's true or not, I don't know, that's attributed this method of loci, the so-called memory palace. Now, your guy, Francis Bacon, who is said to have been the progenitor of the scientific method, said of these mnemonic devices that they are of ostentation prodigious, but fundamentally barren, strangeness without worthiness, stage tricks, more or less. And I don't know whether you saw this book. You might know this fellow's brother. Joshua Foyer's brother was Jonathan Safran Foyer, who wrote a wonderful couple of books. One was called Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, that had to do with the aftermath of the attacks on the United States on 9/11. But Jonathan's brother Joshua, who lives in the town I live in, set out to find out whether a regular mortal can become a mnemonist, can train their memory to remember tremendous amounts of information. The way this is done is with competitions, memory competitions. And although it's sort of trivial sounding, a memory competition is essentially a group of mnemonists on a stage. They're presented with shuffled decks of cards. The card decks might have 500 cards in them or something. And they're just randomly shuffled and given to them. And they have 5 minutes to look at as many as they can. I think it's 5 minutes. And just look at them, whatever method they have. They tend to wear a headset to screen out outside noises. And then they're asked to just recite the cards that they remember. The one who can remember the most wins. And there are actually people who make their career going to these contests, and they perform as mnemonists. And this author actually just did this for 1 year. He trained, and he somehow got into the finals, and he competed, and he didn't win, but he did come in second. And he writes the story about how he still goes to the store and can't remember what his wife asked him to pick up at the store. So what if we had perfect recall? What would life be like? Well, first of all, how much can our brains hold? That's an interesting question. Some folks at Harvard once tried to figure this out, and this is based on the notion that there are 100 billion neurons making an average of 1,000 synapses each. And then if you had each of those be an on-off switch, a sort of 0-1 toggle, as you would in assembly code for a computer, you would then have the ability, in theory, to store 2.5 petabytes of data. So how much is 2.5 petabytes? Well, a petabyte. So this is just a little reminder of what a megabyte, a gigabyte, and a terabyte are. So a petabyte would have all the room you need to store all of the books in print in text format, all of the books there are, including in the libraries in the world. It would also, and 2.5 petabytes actually could store 300 years of standard definition video of all of the stations on the non-cable television, the ones that you receive by antenna. So you have, in theory, the brain has a tremendous capacity, but we of course can't use that. But perfect recall, even if we could have it, may not be so perfect. You probably have read this story. If you haven't, please do. It's only a few pages long. It's a story by Jorge Luis Borges, who of course was the Nobel laureate writer. One of his many, many stories was called Funes the Memorious. That's the translation of it anyway. I don't know in Spanish what it was. But in theory, the story is that Funes had a traumatic brain injury. And ever since age 19, when he had that brain injury, he had perfect eidetic recall. And he was very bothered by the fact that when one looked at a dog at 3:14 in the afternoon from the side, that dog should be called by the same name as a dog seen at 3:15 straight on, because to him they were very different and he remembered them separately. If you had the temerity to say, the sky is so blue, I've never seen it so beautiful, he would say, on November the 5th, 1953, the sky was this blue and perhaps more. You know, he was just tortured by it. He was so tortured by his memory in this story that he just did not want to absorb anything else, and he turned his back to people and looked at the wall and became very depressed so that he wouldn't accidentally learn more. Now, this is a real-life mnemonist, Kim Peek, who's passed away in 2009. You can look on YouTube and find videos of him. It's quite remarkable. Some people have mistakenly called him autistic since he's a calendar savant. He's not autistic. He did have some social deficits. He could remember all of the details of 12,000 books that he'd read. And I mean all the details. You could ask him anything. He would perform, in fact. He's the one who inspired the character Raymond in the movie Rain Man, Dustin Hoffman. Now, he happened to have FG syndrome with complete disconnection of the hemispheres. When he read, he would read both pages simultaneously, his eyes scanned separately, and he would retain everything. It's unclear how, but he would retain everything. So he was a very remarkable character. He had a lot of deficits, though. There was some cost to having this perfect recall. His deficits were more like in the social skills, but not on the spectrum, apparently, by people who examined him. William James, the psychologist who um, uh, did a lot to lay down a lot of the methods that psychologists use, said if we remembered everything, we should on most occasions be as ill off as if we remembered nothing. He also didn't see the value in this. So why is it that some memories we have are so powerful? Well, I think that this explains it. What I call emotional valence, some people call limbic valence. This is what some people lead to the story of flashbulb memories. When you have a traumatic event, it seems that more data is stored than is usually stored when you're just kind of incidentally learning. And the notion is that time appears to slow down because more data is being stored during a traumatic flashbulb event. And the brain seems to store both the data, that is the memory trace, and the emotional trace, or the limbic valence, and then puts them together when needed. And that has something to do with the power of the recall, the emotional valence. And in the United States, at least, I don't know if here, but we all share a common flashbulb memory of 9/11 and watching the coverage of a plane flying into the World Trade Center. Almost anyone who's an adult in the United States would remember that, and possibly the same here. I'm sure you had similar coverage. But without emotional valence, we are never going to be changed by our memories. We're just not changed by our memories without emotional valence. Now, you've probably all heard of the Capgras delusion, the idea that familiar people are not who they say they are, and a family member has somehow been replaced by an imposter. The face is the same, the person will acknowledge. It's quite remarkable how similar this face is to the person whom I love or who's in the family. But there's no emotional valence, so they don't feel the emotional connection. And to them, the face is foreign. Why? Because you don't get the feeling of warmth or connection that you get when you normally look at that face. And that seems to be the basis of the Capgras delusion. And so without emotional valence, our own memories don't even seem familiar to us. They don't seem like our memories. So what if we had no ability whatsoever to remember? Unfortunately, this question was answered for us by William Beecher Scoville and his patient H.M. Henry Molaison, who is now gone, so we know his name. And the red is the area that Beecher Scoville removed in 1953 from H.M.'s brain in an attempt to cure his seizure disorder. It was a bilateral amygdala hippocampectomy done through anterior burr holes and going back 8 centimeters and extirpating that. It happened that Scoville had pioneered this in schizophrenics and had done 300 operations on schizophrenics with the exact same operation and unable to document deficits of any significance, supposedly, after that, although it's hard. He actually published something on this, but it's hard to follow how closely the memory was checked. But it seems that the people just didn't have any dramatic memory loss. But it's assumed that HM's amygdala hippocampus was also damaged because of epilepsy, and added to that, be it bilateral epilepsy. And we learned from this, of course, you never do bilateral medial temporal lobectomies for epilepsy because of this risk. He had a very, very short anterograde recall ability. It was seconds, and that was about it. So can you get this degree of amnesia without the help of a neurosurgeon? Well, another person from England, you might know, I don't know if you all recognize the face, this is Clive Ware. Ware was a very famous, Ware was a very famous musical composer, conductor, and choral conductor in London, who unfortunately got herpes encephalitis and complete destruction of limbic regions of his brain, leaving him with essentially no functioning medial temporal lobes and complete anterograde amnesia. If you've ever treated someone with Korsakoff syndrome, I don't know, how many of you have treated Korsakoff's? So you probably had a similar experience where sometimes people with Korsakoff's who are mild-mannered at least and not somehow upset will experience every day anew And so it has a peculiar effect, for instance, on their social relationships, on their marriage. And Clive Waring got his herpes encephalitis the year after he got married. He was very much in love with his young wife.
Clive really only has less than 30 seconds memory. And sometimes it's as little as perhaps 7 seconds. It's as little as a sentence. You ask him a question and he'll give you an answer, but while he's giving you the answer, he's already forgotten the question. That's how short it is. All he has is void.
This is 20 years after their marriage.
It's been like death. I've never seen a human being before, never had a dream or a thought. The brain has been totally inactive, day and night the same. No thoughts at all. As far as I'm concerned, the doctors have been totally incompetent. I've never seen a doctor the whole time. Oh, look, she's come.
She just closed the door and opened it again.
Oh, you're wonderful.
Don't you wish you could be in love like that?
Musical kiss. I'm dizzy. I don't know which part of the room I'm starting.
It just is yesterday that they had their first date. So is there any treatment for memory disorder like this? This is just an interesting series of experiments, not yet a treatment, but it is a little bit intriguing. Microsoft has this thing called the SenseCam that you can wear. And the SenseCam, you can program it to take photos as frequently as you like during the day. You can set it to take a photo every 5 minutes, for instance, or every 10 minutes. And then you have a family member at the end of the day, put it up on the computer and you review it with them and remind them of what they had done that day. And of course, when they see the photos, just like someone with Korsakoff, they would say, I've never seen that before. Yet you do this with them every night. And apparently, after some weeks of doing this, the person does retain a little bit of a trace of some activities they've done during the day, meaning that there's still some functioning memory that's somehow available. It's intriguing, but it's not to the point of being a treatment. So why do some amnesics fill in the gaps of their memory with tall tales? Now, Waring didn't do that, and HM didn't do that, but some people confabulate tremendously. And I'm sure you've seen that. If you've seen people with orbitofrontal damage, they will sometimes confabulate and tell you these incredible things. And back in the days when we used to see neurosyphilis that affected the frontal lobes, people would have the expansive form of mania and they would confabulate. And I worked at a veterans hospital in Boston, and I think I saw 2 different people who claimed to be General Patton's driver in the war. So confabulation may require the combination of medial temporal with orbitofrontal damage in order to produce this sort of honest lying and loss of self-monitoring. So how is it we remember? This is just briefly. We put a thought into working memory, which probably is dorsolateral, prefrontal, parietal, and a certain amount of cerebellar. The hippocampus seems to consolidate it and put it somewhere and keep a map of where it put it, more or less. And long-term memories perhaps are stored in temporal association cortex, it seems. That's how declarative memory, or our memory for facts and information, things like that, may work. In Alzheimer's disease, long-term memory is eventually lost. In subcortical dementias, long-term memory is probably there, but the person can't find it, and that's why when you do a retrieval memory test, as opposed to the spontaneous recall test, you know, the Alzheimer patient, when you give them several words to learn, are either going to be random or do poorly on recall. The subcortical dementia patient, when you give them several words to learn, will initially do poorly, but you'll show them a longer list of 10 words and tell them to pick out the 4, and they'll accurately pick them out. They just can't access them without the list. So HM wasn't completely without learning. HM could learn skills. And the picture in the upper right is what Brenda Milner and her then postdoc had him do, which was every day for a period of a few weeks, and then they repeated this several times. They brought this mirror box to HM. The mirror box had a mirror at 45 degrees that the patient looks at the mirror, their hands go in to the box. You don't see your hands from above. You can only see them from the mirror. You can't see them directly. And the task is, you have a 5-pointed star, and the task is to take a pencil and trace it without going outside of the lines. It's quite difficult to do while looking in a mirror. And of course, HM would say, I've never seen this before, and I couldn't do this. And he was at first struggle through it. But after a couple of weeks, he would say, I've never seen this before. I don't think I could do it. And then he would be able to do it quickly, demonstrating that he clearly learned without a hippocampus. And so what we did learn from HM was that procedural memory is stored differently. Motor memory is stored a little bit differently than declarative memory. Your basal ganglia learn how to ride a bicycle, it seems, and they store it in your cerebellum. So it's a completely different pathway.
No,
Now this is Clive Waring.
he was.
Being shown a piece of music he says he's never seen, but he was asked to practice each day. It's a difficult piece, but he insists he hadn't seen it. Of course, he'd seen it many times when they showed it to him. Demonstrating that his procedural learning was completely intact with no ability to store declarative memory. Now, autobiographical memory is a whole different kettle of fish. It's much different than memory for facts. Your episodic autobiographical memories are much stronger than other memories because of emotional valence, I think, anyway. The memory of relationships that you have is much more autobiographical than factual. There are people who have been shown to have incredible autobiographical recall. In fact, they're called, what do they call them? HSAMs, highly superior autobiographical memory. Yeah? And there's at one of the University of California campuses, they've been looking for people like this. They now have over 50 people they've found with these HSAMs and have interviewed them and tested them. And their first published case was this woman, Jill Price, who went by AJ in the literature. And of course, like Foyer, who became a champion mnemonist and couldn't remember a shopping list, neither could these people do better at other cognitive tasks apart from their autobiographical memory. Let me just show you one of their people here on video.
Let's say.
Louise says she can remember every day of her life since the age of 11.
Try to talk us through, can you do that? How it works out of the air. April 21st, 1991. 1991, okay, April 21st. So in the moment between April 21st and 1991, I have scrolled through 25 April 21sts, thinking, which one is it going to be? Which one is it going to be? Okay, 1991, which was a Sunday. And I was in Los Angeles, and I had a concert with the American Youth Symphony.
You went to the most important thing
Right,
that happened
that
day.
was the most, I mean, you probably don't want to hear about, sort of the day. Oh, I got up in the morning, and I got dressed.
Yeah, you remember that?
Yeah.
You remember what you had for lunch?
Not what I had for lunch that day, but I do remember what I had for dinner the night before. So,
And effortless. It just pops in.
I mean, for me, it's almost as automatic as if you say, what is your name and where do you live?
So people with this HSAM are not trying to recall things. It's unbidden. It's almost like the Petite Madeleine effect. It just comes to them as quickly as you're asking the question, the answers are already there. So not thinking through it. And yet this is an isolated skill. So memories actually change our neurons. We know this very well. And the mechanism usually to explain this is called long-term potentiation, where the more neuron A stimulates neuron B, the more facile neuron B becomes and the more efficient it becomes at discharging in response to the message from the first neuron. Neuron B can become sensitized for many years, and that's thought to be the basis of LTM or long-term memory. Now, it was Eric Kandel who demonstrated that when this occurs, there's actually dendritic spine growth with learned behavior. That sort of slimy thing to the right is the California sea slug, aplysia. That's what Kandel used as his experimental subject, and basically they were trained to find the sugary liquid. As they learned it, he would then sacrifice. People don't mind you sacrificing sea slugs. Would then demonstrate that there were these little protein blobs that were appearing on dendritic spines as they learned. And that, of course, was his major contribution to memory. Now, this you probably have all heard since you were in grammar school here, the London taxi study. It is always brought out. It's still quite remarkable, and it's been tested again, and it seems like it's stood up. You probably know these researchers, at least Michael probably does. Essentially, to pass, I've been, by the way, very impressed, and I've now been using black cabs rather than Ubers frequently because they really know their stuff. They're really good. So in order to get their license, they have to know every street within 6 miles of Charing Cross. That's apparently 26,000 streets and 20,000 landmarks that they can choose from to take this test. 352 different routes they have to be able to produce. And when in this classic study, it was shown that their posterior hippocampus would grow in those who passed the knowledge and continued to use it driving a cab. When they stopped driving, their posterior hippocampus on the right side would come back to normal size. And as controls, they ran the same test with London bus drivers who follow established routes and have no change in their hippocampus, and professional mnemonists who do the stage mnemonics, and again, they have normal hippocampi. So what is it about the black cab drivers? Well, they, in their minds, have incorporated a tremendous amount of spatial learning and can quickly select a route without having the GPS open in front of them frequently, although I've noticed some use GPS. There's something about the right posterior hippocampus that has to do with visual spatial memory. Now, obviously, remembering can be painful. A number of people here at IOPPN are very interested in this issue about war trauma, et cetera. It can be intense, it can be very long lasting, but it can be inaccurate and still feel accurate to you. And this is well demonstrated in the so-called false memory syndrome. The idea is that when you recall a memory and talk about it and put it back, you are doing reconsolidation of the memory, and there is a chance it might change. Insight-oriented psychotherapy may be a kind of guided memory reconsolidation. The notion is you bring up a memory, you discuss it, and what the therapist is trying to do is adjust the emotional valence of the memory before it's reconsolidated. At least that's the way I think about it. And that's a possible mechanism. But how do we know that there are false memories? Well, this is the work of Elizabeth Loftus, largely, who quite a long time ago in the 90s demonstrated that memories can be implanted. And if you haven't read, probably in your undergraduate psychology studies, you read her studies already. She is extremely hated these days by people who are bringing Me Too lawsuits because she appears for the defense to poke holes in the memories of the victims at some point. But she also has appeared for plaintiffs as well. I mean, she's done both sides. But what she did was she basically gave people, she interviewed family members of people and found some things that happened to them in their lives, and then had her assistant write out 4 stories, 3 of them actual stories that happened at some point in their childhood, and 1 of them involved being 5 years old and being lost in a shopping center, and a kindly older woman staying with you until your mother could be located. And it was just mixed into the stories. And regardless of the fact that those were not part of the memories of the people, she showed that the majority of people tested would eventually recall this thing that didn't happen to them, and it was therefore an implanted memory or false memory. Now, emotional valence can also be changed in a mouse using the optogenetic model. So optogenetics is an extremely cool application of genetics in neuroscience and imaging, where you design a little changed protein, these rhodopsins, where a laser light directed at them will cause the gene to be expressed or not. And so in the hippocampal dentate neurons that encode memory, it's been shown in mice that you can adjust the emotional valence of a memory. Therefore, you could say treat the mouse's post-traumatic stress disorder, I guess you could say, using light. So essentially the mouse is trained on the Morris water maze, they are exposed to certain fear stimuli, et cetera. So they'll go a certain place, they won't go a certain place. And then you flip the switch and the fear is gone and they go to the place that they had learned not to go. And it's quite remarkable, and it does mean that maybe there is hope for learning how to flip our switches. So you probably recognize this classic picture of Mark Twain. Has anyone not heard of Mark Twain? Very famous American comic writer of the 19th century. Mark Twain has 100 different expressions that are valuable for teachers. He was very interested in education. But what he said about memory was, when I was younger, I could remember everything, whether it happened or not. Now I'm getting older and soon shall remember only the latter. One of my favorite quotes of his. So not remembering, of course, can be very painful. But HM was not particularly pained by his amnesia. He didn't seem to mind also being tested. He was welcoming to Milner and her associate. And on the other hand, when you treat people with TBI, with traumatic brain injury, very often they will feel that unless they can get back that period of retrograde amnesia and a little bit of anterograde amnesia that they have, they're not going to be whole again. And they just feel like something's missing from their lives. They're bothered by the period of retrograde amnesia leading up to their injury. It's painful for them. And word finding issues of normal aging drive all of us to distraction. Most of you are young in the room and you probably not had this experience, but I find that I have these problems all the time. My wife and I will be invited to someone's home for dinner. And on the way in the automobile, we'll be kind of discussing their children and trying to remember their children's names. And we haven't seen them in a while. And we're just realizing, oh my God, we're going to be embarrassed. We can't remember their children's names. And then we start, well, it's 2 syllables. And the other one says, is it a color? No. And then the other one says, wait, it's a biblical name. We're going, David, Joseph. We go to the door, ring the bell on the door. Our hosts open the door and one of us will whisper into the other, it's Aaron. Problem solved. It happens all the time. I'm going to play you a video of a poem by my favorite American poet about this process that happens to all of us as we age, but to some much more rapidly than others. And I hope you'll forgive me showing you a poem, but I do like it.
Forgetfulness. The name of the author is the first to go, followed obediently by the title, the plot, the heartbreaking conclusion, the entire novel, which suddenly becomes one you have never read, never even heard of. It is as if one by one the memories you used to harbor decided to retire to the southern hemisphere of the brain, to a little fishing village where there are no phones. Long ago, you kissed the names of the 9 muses goodbye, and you watched the quadratic equation pack its bag. And even now, as you memorize the order of the planets, something else is slipping away, a state flower, perhaps, the address of an uncle, the capital of Paraguay. Whatever it is you are struggling to remember, it is not poised on the tip of your tongue, not even lurking in some obscure corner of your spleen. It has floated away down a dark, mythological river whose name begins with an L, as far as you can recall, well on your own way to oblivion, where you will join those who have forgotten even how to swim and how to ride a bicycle. No wonder you rise in the middle of the night to look up the date of a famous battle in a book on war. No wonder the moon in the window seems to have drifted out of a love poem that you used to know by heart.
Billy Collins, if you care to look him up, he's written many, many wonderful poems. This one is particularly sad, especially as I notice more and more word finding problems myself. So the feeling of familiarity, emotional valence, is sometimes all that remains. Probably many of you, or most of you, or maybe all of you, have a relative or a friend who's suffered with Alzheimer's disease. I don't know if it's even possible anymore not to know someone who has. And if you've had the experience when you greet someone who's well into their Alzheimer's disease at the middle stage, typically, unless there's something else wrong, they will embrace you and greet you and say, "Oh, hi, how are you?" And they'll take a chance, say, "How are your children?" They clearly have the social aspects of the communication, yet they don't know who you are, and they don't remember your children. The last thing that remains, though, is the emotional valence. They know you're familiar, and then eventually that goes too. Eventually, the not remembering no longer seems painful. It does at first, but eventually, as Alzheimer's progresses, it's not obvious that the not remembering is still painful to the person themselves. But there is hope. There is hope. And here is some of it. Aging-related memory loss in mouse model may be reversible. This is from 2017. An interesting paper where Krebs, which is it's a cyclic AMP-related gene, where if you overexpress this Krebs gene product in the dorsal CA1 nuclei of the mouse hippocampus, the mouse who has been bred for long-term memory deficits can learn once again. It somehow enables learning in a mouse that's bred for accelerated memory aging, I guess. So there is some hope. Also, memory itself can be therapeutic. We judge ourselves by comparison with remembered figures. Do all of you have a mentor someplace in your past that you remember fondly? Think of them for a moment. Can any of you quote exactly what they told you? Or is it more that you remember the feeling of working with them and how they made you feel? So we judge ourselves by comparison with remembered figures. You're looking at my three most prominent mentors, Gustav Eckstein, Edith Kaplan, and Norman Geschwind. And when I'm doing something like I'm doing right now, I'm thinking, would they approve or disapprove? If they disapprove, I'm going to be sad and get depressed. If I think they would approve, I'm going to feel better about myself and my ego will get a boost. In fact, we sometimes remember our mentors in a therapeutic way. This fellow passed away in London about 15 years ago, I think. Vladimir Bukovsky. I came to know him when I was a medical student and he was in prison in the former Soviet Union. And he and a psychiatrist from Ukraine, who is still alive, Semyon Glizman, wrote a book entitled A Manual on Psychiatry for Dissidents. And when I was a medical student, I helped get this translated and mailed to all of the members of the American Psychiatric Association. We were working with a fellow here in London named Peter Reddaway at the time, and at the London School of Economics, Political Science. And during his imprisonment, he was put in solitary confinement for 3 years. And this book is not only about his life as a dissident and his life in the prison camps in Russia, but it's about how he kept himself sane for 3 years. He built a castle. He was a skilled, he had some engineering skills. His first year in solitary, he designed a castle. He began to make mental calculations without having the ability to write anything down, because they don't give you that. Mental calculations of how much block he would need, how much brick, how much wood, how much pipe, what sort of contractors he would need. The second year, he built it. And in his mind, he had all sorts of problems. There were leaks in the plumbing. The contractor didn't show up. He did everything he could to keep himself sane. The third year, he decorated his castle, and suddenly his solitary term was over. Kept himself sane by using memory. This is, of course, George Santayana, who says our collective memory can help us not repeat the past, though at least in our country, I'm not sure if that's working at the moment. And this, by Maya Angelou, indicates that she in her way, this poet was quite aware of the phenomenon of autobiographical memory and limbic valence. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And that's the notion of the limbic valence behind autobiographical memory. So after all of this about remembering, we shouldn't underestimate the value of forgetting either. Is Jean Valjean entitled to rehabilitation? If someone commits a crime and pays their debt to society, pays their fines, goes to jail, whatever, they come out, should they not be allowed to reinvent themselves? If someone makes a mistake in their life and is a better person for it, should they not be allowed to reinvent themselves? We are, after all, in psychiatry, and we believe in rehabilitation, right? Yet, as a society, we're not very good at forgetting. And of course, there is the internet, which you simply cannot take it off Google. You cannot un-Google yourself. And this, of course, keeps people from being able to leave their past behind, when in some cases, it would be helpful if they could. So is our memory becoming vestigial anyway? You can now get a 100 terabyte mini SD chip to put in your computer if you'd like. Of course, we all use things like Dropbox, and that's my little camera disk there of a terabyte. We use all these things, and we no longer have to remember things ourselves. You know, Uber drivers don't need to pass the knowledge. They just turn on Waze in their smartphone. So summary, well, we're defined by our memories. We should wish for a good but not a perfect memory. Emotional connection is what embeds a memory most firmly. Memory changes our brains, helps us endure difficult times, and it's possible that memory reconsolidation may be how some psychotherapies work. So in the hippocampus is our memory map, and the communication between the amygdala and orbitofrontal cortex has something to do with emotional valence, and in the accumbens, nucleus accumbens, where dopamine communication is going on, positive reinforcement and another form of learning by positive reinforcement, e.g. like addiction, et cetera, is happening. And so that's it. That's our little trip down memory lane. And here's the mnemonic for everything we talked about. I hope I haven't made you sad and maybe made you ask some questions of yourself from this. So.
Thanks, Sheldon. Another cracking talk. I know people might have to whiz off to clinics or other Zoom Teams meetings, but got time for some questions.
Sorry, we consumed 15 minutes playing with the technology.
Well, we got there in the end, so it was a sort of stress test to get through that. But thank you. I don't know if there's any questions from the audience. If anyone's got any particular questions, but in the meantime, just about that stress test and the interaction of stress and memory, it's I guess one of the big things, and again, it'd be good to get Mike's view on this as well, is what we increasingly know as or call functional cognitive disorder. So the ability of over-attention to a problem, sort of making it so. And the example I find so helpful in clinic is of the cocktail party where you're with somebody, and you mentioned something similar about forgetting a name, but when someone comes up and you know them someone you've known for years, and then you're under pressure to remember them and you are locked out, there's no way you're going to remember their name, and the more you think about it, the worse it gets.
And you pretend you don't remember, or you pretend you do remember?
I don't even know what I do. I just panic. But I guess my thoughts about that is whether you can somehow train yourself to just stop diving down that abyss of anxiety and stress and pull yourself out and be able to, because you clearly know it's just relaxing, and sometimes just laughing about saying, oh, I can't believe I've forgotten their name, so sorry, we all do it, don't you, rather than thinking it's just me, I've failed, and somehow stopping that happening with a sort of little bit of CBT and practice, you could sort of do something, and that might also be a model for preventing functional cognitive disorder, which we see so much in FND patients, and then also across the board in many patients, but also again, particularly in long COVID, we see quite a lot of it as well. But anyhow, I'm just wondering what Mike and others think about, and what your views are on. I know you've got where functional memory problems and other mood related and others come and start and stop is an interesting concept in itself. But
Michael, I'd be interested to hear what you think, but I'm wondering whether what Tim's describing, which happens to all of us, isn't actually active inhibition. That is, that the norepinephrine of the moment is somehow inhibiting. It's actually making it harder to recall. There's an active inhibition going on, but I'm not sure. Do you have a thought on that?
Stoltz's law applies so that you can have too little or too much arousal, stress. You need to be at an optimal level to remember accurately.
Yeah.
For the people out there, I'm just going to repeat what Professor Koppelman said. Essentially, the issue is if you have either too much or too little activation and stress, it'll impact your memory. And the idea is to get to just the right place. Did I summarize that?
But it almost feels like it's your conscious self meddling with a process that would work fine if you hadn't just stuck your spanner in it by trying too hard, which is the classic thing of a functional tremor or functional paralysis. It works fine automatically, but your conscious self is, or the mechanics of the process at a high level have basically just stamped on what would be working fine if you hadn't got in the way of it. And that's of course completely out of our control, and that these examples show exactly. It's almost the harder you try, the harder it gets to stop this process. It runs away with itself. But anyhow, that's my music. I'll quickly look at the chat. Well, there's any other questions in the audience? We've gone on quite a lot. Just check. I don't see anything there. Any hands up? There's some. Sorry, Miles. Yeah.
I was just going to say, the example you brought up is interesting because it might relate to the space between what you were saying about everything is stored online. There's sort of a permanent, indelible record of things. I wonder if similarly we worry and don't allow ourselves the freedom to try and fail. The way you gave the example of turning up to the door, knocking on the door, that's right. So often, in fact, the solutions to problems, particularly in a social context, happen because as you say, Tim, the necessity activates something unconsciously that happens automatically, implicitly. But when we don't allow ourselves a chance because of fear of being imperfect, fear of being criticized, fear of being judged, which perhaps becomes more the case when everything is recorded and the sense of everything being recorded in a very sort of attentive world where everything feels watched and seen, rather than in a more forgiving group of friends. Like, I'd like to think that you were turning up to a house party where you were with friends and could laugh. But if one felt one couldn't laugh, if one had perhaps attachment issues or difficulties that made it harder to forgive oneself, that might be harder.
And that would be probably your frontal systems kind of projecting into the future what's going to happen because of this, which then inhibit your ability to remember. But when you say feeling watched, I just have to say, by the way, I have never seen so many cameras in a city as you have in London. I've begun training myself to watch for them, and they are literally everywhere. It's quite impressive. So
I think I've repressed I just don't even like to think about it.
They're everywhere.
Yeah. Sorry, Mike. Yeah.
I could make lots of comments, but can I just make two anecdotes? One was I recently met up with school friends that I hadn't seen for 60 years. So I asked them all to write down on a bit of paper. We were all in the same room when we heard that President Kennedy had been shot. So I asked them all to write down what they could remember. Got a 50% response rate, but one of them lost his bit of paper. So that cut us down to two. We both remembered the prefect coming into the common room to tell us, but we had totally different ideas as to who it was. And of course, we both believed we were right. We were both absolutely certain, as occurs with flashbulb memories. People make mistakes, but they think they're right. The second thing is that Brenda Milner has recently had her 105th birthday. That was in The Guardian. I know that she was cognitively intact at 100. She got a 7-year research grant at 91. Muriel Leesack died in her 90s. Elizabeth Warrington is pushing 91. So I am hoping that the study of the neuropsychology of memory is more powerful for healthy aging than genetics.
I'm similarly hoping that. And by the way, I saw Brenda Milner when she was 100, and maybe when she was 100, I was at a meeting, and she was presenting. I tried to consult her on a project I was doing, and I was told she no longer will answer emails or anything when she was 103. So her assistant wouldn't allow that, and I don't know whether or not she's still doing research, but I wouldn't be surprised. But I will answer your anecdote with another. I gave a talk on memory once that included some of this, and asked everyone, this is in a US audience, of people who would have been present at 9/11. And I asked for a show of hands of how many people in the room remembered watching on television the first plane flying into the World Trade Center. And in a room of maybe 150 people, perhaps there were 3 or 4 who didn't remember that. Yet that film wasn't available for 24 hours after the attack. The only thing we saw was sometime later the second plane flying into the second tower. Everyone believed that they had seen the other. And there was no treachery or trickery on my part. I simply asked. It's not hard to show that memories can be manipulated. Is there something online?
Yeah, there is. There's a question from Vasilisa. I don't know if you can unmute and turn your camera on and ask the question. If not, I can.
Oh, here, let me turn this off.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we can hear you. Crack on.
So I have two questions. The first one, since many devices were invented to store our memories and different types of information, did it affect somehow memorization and learning and memory skills in modern people? Because we all use like Google, Wikipedia, and so on, so on, so on. This is the first question.
Where are you, Vasilisa? Sorry, out of interest.
I'm geographically.
Oh no, yeah, geographically, yes. Sorry, just I'm not sure if you're which country you're in or where you're from. Because
I'm here in Freiburg. It's Germany.
Great. Okay. Perfect. Thank you. So I don't know if you got.
Boy, that is a great question, and I've actually tried to look this up about once every 2 years to see if, in general, our memories are less since we've had such elaborate mnemonic assistant devices. However, the question's been asked before. When the book appeared in the 15th century, the question was whether people's memories worsened because people used to remember, the religious prophets, whatever, they would remember things, tremendous long tractates of the Quran or the Bible, whatever, because they had to. And it was common to do that. And it is thought that we don't practice memory quite as much as people used to. Yet I know people, for instance, in the Jewish tradition who do practice, and they, for instance, read the Hebrew scrolls every week, and they pretty much have it memorized after several years. And so I think that the capacity is not lost to humanity, it's just that not using it.
I'll just comment from having kids, because they're farther down the track than we are in terms of the changes in needing to learn stuff, is that we're judging ourselves by the standards of what was needed in an old environment. The new environment requires you to remember 100 YouTube videos and the details of those, and your friends online, not necessarily the facts and the books and the things that we think are important in our age. So I think there's going to be a natural adaptation, and I think we judge it as a loss of something, whereas actually they're just doing other things and remembering other different things to what we need in our current or recent past environment.
Your children will remember verbatim the exact hypocritical thing you did when they were 7 years old, and they'll remember it for the rest of their lives. So I think the capacity is still there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, and there's a second question, was there, Vasilisa?
The second question is, I'm making a video podcast on YouTube about brain and neuroscience, and I would be so happy if you could, Dr. Benjamin, participate in my podcast and talk about memory. So I just couldn't miss this opportunity to invite you.
It's very kind, nice use of the plug there. That's great. So what I'll ask is Sheldon to email you if you could put it in the chat separately. So he's not unless you want to.
Yeah, no,
to
just
reply positively.
Yeah, just Professor Nicholson's my agent.
I take a cut.
Just contact him and he'll get you my email address if you don't have it already.
Thank you very much.
And Anne-Marie, I think we covered the functional cognitive disorder a fair bit. I think it's how you frame what FCD is, but my view is that it is that locking out of access to memories. So it's not a subjective objective. It's just that the conditions for allowing you to remember something are tweaked by your overzealous attention. Essentially, is the way I'd see it. But
there have been some experiments about whether or not if you give a soldier a beta blocker, sending them into war, and they're in a traumatic environment, whether or not you can prevent the acquisition of post-traumatic stress. It's not been very impressive, but I know there were experiments to that effect.
Yeah.
So
fantastic.
Because you prevent the norepinephrine storm.
Yeah. Indeed, and of course the treatments here, and elsewhere, of using, sort of MDMA treatment of PTSD, sort of allowing people to remove those barriers to dealing with memories from the past. So lots of fascinating stuff going on there. But brilliant talk as always, Sheldon. A great tour of fascinating stuff, and it's great to think about the mnemonists and all these other people, which I think we often focused on pathology, but it's always interesting to look at the full range of performance as well, up into the exceptional, to sort of inform us. But thank you again for this and all the other talks, and big round of applause from us in the audience and everywhere else. Look forward to hearing more of your talks in the future. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for making this possible and for hosting me.